Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our series, The Soviet New Wave, a look at some films from the mid-1960s in the Soviet Union that portray the baby boomer generation. What was their life like? This film today is I Am 20, and it's focused on that age set and its experience. Joining us to talk about this magnificent film will be Yulia Alekseyeva, and we'll be talking about it and much more after today's screening. Now, take this trip to Moscow in the mid-1960s in I Am 20. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to visit a Moscow that I don't think has been shown this way much, and certainly not on American media. This is a major film, a major Russian film, a major Soviet film, and there's much to discuss about its artistry, its context, etc. And it's a pleasure to have here to discuss it, a good friend of City Cinematheque, multiple appearances here, Yulia Alekseyeva. She is an assistant professor at University of Pennsylvania. She's the author recently of Anti-Fascism and the Avant-Garde, a radical documentary of the 1960s. And she's a scholar of, among other things, Soviet, Russian, Japanese cinema. So, welcome back, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Great. Let's just start with a little bit of the reception history of this film. I'll first of all say that it was, begin by saying it was censored and recut in 1965. What we've seen here is the restored print of 1989. But let's begin with this whole question of, in the moment of the Khrushchev thaw, we'll talk about a little what that was, why this was a film that was censored. What would be wrong with the film?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's very, very complicated. As many people might already know, the thaw, Khrushchev's thaw, began around 1956. There was what we refer to as a secret speech, where Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality. So this led to huge decrease in censorship, a real flourishing of the arts. And one thing that it did was encourage younger directors who are a little bit more experimental, a little bit outside of the box, to experiment in their work. And so there's a lot of, on one hand, influence from the 1920s, where things were also very experimental and new, onto the 1960s and the late 1950s. So a big kind of film example of that is the film Cranes Are Flying,
right,
by Kalatazov. And this won the highest prize at Cannes. It was an incredibly influential film, and I think a film like that, really expressed and embodied how experimental formally the films from that era could be, and how much less propagandistic they feel than the films from Stalin's era. So I Am 20 first comes out in a version of the film that was longer than the eventual released version. It's around 3 hours long, and it was originally called Ilyich's Gate, or Zastava Ilyich. And this is a reference to Vladimir Lenin, and specifically the Gate of Lenin. And we all saw the guards, the three guards, symbolizing the three friends, protecting, the tomb of Lenin, the mausoleum. And Khrushchev specifically, denounced that version of the film for many, many reasons. From the contemporary standpoint, the reasons for the denouncing feel completely strange, because to me the film feels...
Please chronicle this a bit, yeah.
Yeah, it feels quite patriotic to me, actually, watching the film. Today, there's really a tremendous love for the Soviet Union and for the project and the idea of communism. But at the time, it was seen as too formally inventive, too experimental. One denouncement or reason for the denouncement that I heard about that I think is extremely absurd is that the footsteps of the Lenin's guards were too loud, and that the people of Moscow were sleeping. And how could they be so loud, waking up all of Moscow with their steps? But the most well-known, I think, reason for the denouncement was that at the end of the film, as we saw, Seryoja, or Sergei, has this, we don't know if it's a dream, we don't know if it actually happened, he's a ghost, imagined conversation with his father.
Right.
And his father doesn't give him advice. Seryoja just wants advice, like, how do I go forward? I don't know what to do with my life. He's 23 years old, and the father says, I have no advice to give you because I'm 21 years old. You're 2 years older. I can't give you advice. And so there's the sense that, as I'm sure we'll talk about soon, there's this generational divide.
Right.
And it never really resolves. And the film resolves with or it doesn't resolve, but it kind of ends with this feeling of ennui or estrangement. And I think that is what Khrushchev and the other kind of party members are responding to, is it doesn't resolve this generational gap.
Right, and that's what they were looking for. I mean, they were looking for, again, socialist realism always called for at least the proposition of a positive resolution that was available in the near future, if not available that particular day, but was aspirational in that way, but aspirational with clarity.
Right.
And this is a film that is much about the joy of being that age, but also the confusion of that age, of being that particular generation, and how do we respond to the burden of being the first generation after those who experienced and suffered the Great Patriotic War, as it's referred to, as World War II is referred to. This is again one of those things where this is a positive film, because it embraces a deeply humanist film who wishes to get very close to these characters to see how they're trying to move forward, but it also shows how they can't move forward with a certain clarity, and that's very upsetting, particularly, I mean, you know, to someone of a generation who wants the previous generation to be seen as the site of all wisdom and the guidance for the future.
Right. Right, and so the film comes out a few years later, in 1964, in a much more truncated version, and this is the film that was called I Am 20, even though it's a little bit strange that I always thought that the title was strange because he's 23 and not 20, so it's a little strange, but certain scenes are recut. The discussion with the father at the end resolves in a more kind of maybe more Stalinist, socialist, realist. There is an actual resolution feeling to it. The scene with Anya's father is also truncated so that it, what I've heard described is that it, instead of it being this real kind of battle between the two of them with a lot of tension, instead it almost feels like the two of them are apologizing to each other.
Okay.
So it's a very different feel, a very different affect in the 1964-65 version. And then finally in the 80s with Perestroika and the opening, many films, I think around 250, were kind of taken from the vault and reshown, especially on television, but not just. And so this was one of those films that became lauded in that period. And Khutsiev created a kind of director's cut, and I believe this is the cut that we have.
Yes, it's my understanding of what we're screening is the director's. Is the director's cut, and you know, again, he was around 25 years later to supervise that, and so we get to see. So we've already mentioned something, that this is an innovative film in any number of ways, hearkening back to this notion that comes from the 1920s that the Soviet experiment is a unique experiment in history, and therefore it requires unique forms of art to capture the nature of that experience. But some of this is new and experimental, but some of it is also linked to very profound threads in Russian culture itself. So let's start out with the fact that not so many films that we see have as much poetry in them as this film, and poetry is all over this film. Why? Yeah. Why in this particular film, and how does that relate to particular Russian traditions, both of life and of mixed art forms?
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily think it's Russian as opposed to Eastern European generally. Like, I think the director was actually of Georgian ethnicity, but I think, I personally, I was born in Kiev, and my family wasn't necessarily Russian, but still the importance of poetry is something that I think is
Let's say Slavic culture.
Important. Yeah, Eastern European, post-Soviet, I think there's something about the importance of poetry. And I hear, even at Penn now, I'm in an English department, and the poetry professors are constantly lamenting how poetry is not appreciated as much as it should be in the United States, but in former Soviet states and former Soviet republics, I think there's still a huge interest and real obsession with poetry. Students memorize poems, and I have no doubt that the character, Sergei, was on one hand kind of forced to memorize these poems, but also it's something that people genuinely love. So we have the scene where I think another thing to talk about in the film is how quasi-documentary it is, the kind of documentary elements where, hundreds of people are cramming into this auditorium just to hear poets speak. And to me, I think that's kind of unheard of, in the context of the United States, with a few select exceptions maybe, but I think one of the poets was Yevgeny Yevtushenko. There are just, people from the street in real life were clamoring to get in to this poetry reading that was put on by Khutsiev himself. So he created this for the film. People on the street heard about it. They said, I need to go to the screening. And so it was a chaotic, almost, I think, week-long process of shooting 9 to 5 to try to get this scene. So clearly the director thought poetry is going to be central. And I think there's something about this era where truly artistic production was extremely important, the arts and culture. And I think it's important I think there are two main poets that figure the most in the film. There's a scene in the close to maybe the first third of the film, almost at the end of the first part of the film, right after Sergei meets Anya, where there's this beautiful tracking shot, and he's walking, and you at first don't realize it's his thoughts. And I think what I love what this film does with the internal and external, how first you hear his monologue, and then it becomes his conversation with his friends, and it kind of weaves in and out of interior and exterior. And he's actually reciting a poem by Pushkin about like the autumn frost, and the poem sometimes becomes things he says, and he goes back into the poem, back out. And later on, there's this beautiful scene where he's, love-struck, and it's dawn, and he's walking through the streets of Moscow, and he is, in his head, reciting a poem by Mayakovsky called Past 1 O'Clock, which is actually, I believe, part of it is his suicide note. So it's like a very intense poem, and Mayakovsky, he committed suicide in 1930, and he was kind of brought back, I guess, in the late 50s, early 60s as an example of the aesthetic possibilities of the Soviet Union that were thwarted with Stalinism. So I think the fact that he's reciting Mayakovsky and kind of goes in and out and repeats certain lines, and the way that I think people imagine or think about lines of poetry in their head, so it's very documentarian or subjective. Like, he doesn't get the poem right. He kind of goes in and out, repeats lines, stops and starts.
Well, and you bring up this very interesting point that it's a cluster of the things that are happening in the film. These are the characters. I mean, Sergei more than anyone else, but all the characters in the film are granted interior lives that are very rich. And interior lives are not very important to socialist realist art and to official art, because that which is important is what you are doing as a member of the collective community moving the project forward. And so you can struggle about how productive you are as a worker or something like that, but the way in which the poetry and the interior monologues get us involved in the, first of all, in the affective world. How are they experiencing this walk through the park? And at this particular moment of crisis among the three men, or in the romance with Anya, or whatever, and this is granting something that had been taken away from people. Their interiority in a certain way. And this film is deeply dedicated to granting that to all the characters. And in rather, I think, it's simple to say it, in a rather beautiful way, rather compelling, because we enter into this experience with them.
Right, right. And, as we all know, obviously the people are flawed and have strange thoughts and beliefs. And, the fact that these are young people who have, a very, I think, 20s existential ennui,
Right.
and they're bored, and they sometimes do not great things. Like in this rewatching of the film, the fact that Sergei, sleeps with a woman and then kind of forgets about her and leaves her.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
is certainly not something that would have been portrayed as something a protagonist is doing in
Right.
a socialist realist film, but they're complicated people, and of course have extremely rich interior lives. And we see this, I think, more than any other era in Soviet history in the late 50s to early 1960s. And I
Right.
think the release of the truncated version of the film really marks the end of
Right.
this brief, perhaps 6-7 year flourishing
Right.
called, Khrushchev's thaw, in which there were many films that came out that granted people this kind of interiority that is a lot more complicated.
Right.
Yeah.
This is also a film, but I'm going to take it the opposite way, but you've already mentioned it, that gives us just this visually magnificent portrait of Moscow in this particular way, that has this very strongly documentary aspect to it. Now, I will circle back to socialist realism just for a second by saying that socialist realism, you could almost say it's always polished realism, because it's the aspirational reality in some kind of way. Whereas this is, there are many things that are very, very carefully and beautifully staged here, but also he's just got the camera out in the city. So what do you see as the film telling us about Moscow at this particular moment? What kind of place is in its portrayal? What kind of place is Moscow?
I mean, actually, the film, for all of its criticisms from Khrushchev and others, seems so celebratory of the city. Yeah. The parade sequence is extremely famous, quite long, I think 20, 30 minutes of just the May 1st parade. The bank of the river it's constantly shining. It's a place of celebration of public life.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, there are all of these young people dancing. There's really such a joy, and I think the emphasis on public infrastructure and the tram, that he takes, where one of his friends has this kind of flirtation with
Right.
Katya, the train conductor, announcer person, ticket taker. And there's really the way in which Moscow is almost like a playground for these three young men. And it's funny, when I was telling my friends that, I'm going to do this interview, this discussion about the film, I was trying to figure out how to describe it, and I described it as kind of like Sex in the City, but with young 20-somethings figuring themselves out in probably the best time to have lived in the Soviet Union, in the way that New York, in the late 90s and early 21st century is also kind of this flourishing of wealth in New York.
No, I think it's absolutely an appropriate reference. The one I'll counter-reference you.
Yeah.
Okay? No, my counter-reference would be American Graffiti, in which we have, once again, it's a generational portrait of a group of young people living in a particular kind of community, which is very, very interested in the public life and what this scene is like. And could it be possible that this film was too ludic for the authorities, and people are having too much fun in a certain kind of way. I'm not sure that flies.
Yeah, but it's possible. It's very, very hard to know. It is quite funny, and I think, about little tidbits like when I think it was Kolka who like gives the apple to Katya, and
Yes,
he's like, "Here's an apple," and what? It's just very silly and fun, ludic for absolutely very fun-loving film. Moscow was presented in a very beautiful way. It really does seem like the criticism was about the generational struggle.
Oh, let's talk about talk about that and what that how it shows up in the film and how it's a it's a very important thing because we should always remind people 20 million people died in the Second World War, definitive experience of a generation. There are the references to how many people do not have fathers because the fathers were all killed in the war. So it's a particular generation growing up with more mothers than fathers.
Yeah.
And even though the father here was not killed in the war, he is since passed because we have the youngest brother in the household. Still, it's a mother household.
Yeah, I think he did die in the war. I was a little confused about that. I think the younger child is actually a neighbor's child. But anyway, it's a little bit confusing.
The actual biological father, but of course, has died because that's the one of the most important things in the film is that scene of the father.
Right.
No, I died when I'm.
Right.
He knows exactly. I die the next day.
Yeah.
He describes that, and we have the very haunting scene of looking at the dead young men.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in what ways do you find that the generational conflict is dealt with in the film?
Yeah, I think it's actually dealt with in a very touching and tender way, where clearly there's this generational difference, and you see this the most obviously in the conversation with Anya's father, where he, is berating really their generation, the baby boomer generation, for being, for almost caring too much, or for being outside the box, for not trusting in the wisdom of their generation, for doing their own thing. And then, it's quite cynical, the character of that father, but then you have this clear desire of the protagonist to connect with his father that was denied him. And, it is impossible to overstate just how every single family was affected by the war, where, I think it was something like a quarter to a fifth of the entire population of the Soviet Union died.
Right.
More, I think, so with these 20 million people, so this generation of fatherless people, it's quite rare actually for both for both mother and father to be alive during this time. So, inevitably there's a generational gap, and there, and the young people, most of the young people that you see don't have memories of the war. Either they were babies or they were born right after the war, so they, and this is talked about in baby boomer generations around the world, that they just didn't feel the hardships, of the Great Depression and the war, that they came of age and in a more optimistic moment, and therefore there's often cynicism with regard to that generation for, they need to listen to their elders. Why can't they just do what they're told, But actually, Sergei is in almost like an in-between stage where he remembers the war. Actually, he was young, and the potatoes are extremely famous.
Potatoes.
Right? The potatoes, because he, as his mother described earlier in the film, they lived off of potatoes. They didn't have their rations. I think they lost their rations for bread, and so they just lived on potatoes. And so when he says, I will toast to potatoes, that is his, memory and the family's story for how they survived this horrible time when the Nazis were, encroaching upon Moscow.
Right.
There was nothing
at the
to
gates.
eat. Yeah.
Absolutely. They made it very close. And of course, this is a film so beautifully designed, etc. So then the fact that potatoes and potato salad is a traditional New Year's dish, and the people show up with the potatoes. So that's but there's this kind of rhyming in it of, well, wait a minute, potatoes meant survival. And then here we're showing up with the catered potatoes from this. And this is how far we've come. But with coming that far can mean a kind of amnesia about the past that's not really that useful. And there needs to be this recognition.
Right. And they're playing with the potatoes.
Absolutely.
Actually, the potatoes appear and they're just rolling them around the floor, and I can only imagine, this character thinking like, wow, I would have killed for one of those potatoes.
Well, I think I don't get lines like that very often. But I think we've just really run out of time.
No.
So we're going to end with, I would kill for those. I was going to kill for those potatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, or more generally about City University Television, there's a way to find out. It's not a surprise. It's our website, www.tv.cuny.edu. You're going to find information there about our programming on City Cinematheque, but more broadly about the programming across City University Television. Also, if you'd like to send comments to us, there's a way to do so from our website. Oh, and do you need another app on your device? Well, you can get it there too. You can get the CUNY TV app, and therefore you can stream a number of things from your little device. So please visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Julia, always a pleasure to have you here, bringing a wealth of knowledge about Russian culture. Look forward to further conversations.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. This is truly one of my favorite films.
Okay. I vote with you, my friend. Okay. Thank you for joining us here today on City Cinematheque. And please join us in coming weeks as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. But for now, it's goodbye.